we're talking about, it's shortened to ESPR, so it's the Ecodesign for Sustainable Products Regulation. And again, it kind of goes in tandem with the EU's packaging and packaging waste regulation. So I pulled together a very brief agenda. So we'll talk about what the regulation is, what it aims to achieve. Then we'll look at kind of like the core components. So some of this you might have already read on blogs or seen on videos. You might have heard reference to digital product passports. You might have heard reference to disclosures around unsold consumer products and so on. So we're going to dive into those and explain at this point in terms of what we know, what are these actually going to mean. And then we'll look at the impacted parties. So we look at compliance from a manufacturer's perspective, an importer's perspective, distributors, online marketplace, and so on. I'll touch on what the EU is floating as potential means of reducing the burden on small businesses. So that's businesses with less than 50 employees. There may be some derogations around compliance. There may be, certain limitations to data sets that we have to report and so on. So I think the EU has recognised, particularly with the sustainability regulation, the disproportionate burden that it places on small businesses that, don't have a phalanx of employees to address this kind of regulation and make sure that they're compliant, and also the costs involved in complying with this kind of regulation. So I think they do recognise it, and obviously we saw back in February them pull back on a number of pieces of regulation around CBAM and reporting and so on, where it was disproportionately impacting small businesses. So we know that they're aware of this. So we'll keep an eye on this. And obviously, if there are areas that you don't need to comply on, then we'll make sure that you're aware of that. Then we'll talk about the implementation timeline. So from where we sit today, what are we looking at over the course of the next 5 years for this regulation to be fully implemented? And then importantly, how do we prepare, from sitting where we are today, what are the things that we should be looking at so that we can get slightly ahead of the curve on this? So what is ESPR? So ESPR is regulation that replaces an existing directive. So there is an Ecodesign directive, but that has focused on energy related products in the past. So ESPR, the regulation, looks to consolidate everything in a way that we've talked about before, kind of come away from directives that allow a certain amount of regulatory scope creep amongst member states and instead move to a kind of consolidated regulation that's managed by the Commission, and there's very little scope for deviation amongst member states. So there's that element to it, but it also looks to build on the success of the existing Ecodesign directive, because that's seen to have been quite a flagship directive in the EU. And when the EU's kind of monitored its performance and whether it's met its objectives, it feels like it has. So it wants to extend the scope beyond energy related products, and we'll talk about those products that are going to be included in regulation in this first tranche. But in terms of the existing directive, they want to see similar kind of results. So with the Ecodesign directive just focusing on the energy related products, they've tracked around a 12% reduction in final energy consumption. That was just the figures back in 2023. They're seeing cost savings of in excess of 250 euros per household, and that's set to increase to in excess of 700 euros per household by 2030. So they're seeing energy savings or cost savings in households, and they recognise that the consumers have been taken on a journey. So now in excess of 90% of consumers recognise the energy label when they're buying those kind of energy related products. So there's a desire amongst consumers to actually hunt out those energy saving products. And obviously, having tracked the kind of sales of these products across the block, they can see that suppliers and retailers are seeing an increase in demand for those products that perform better from an energy perspective. So this is kind of like what they're looking to build upon with ESPR. So if you like, ESPR is going to replicate this success, but on a much broader scale. So what are the implications for you as a business? So I suppose the one that I always default back to when I'm talking about what do these kind of changes mean to manufacturers, I'll usually go to textiles, because textiles has quite a poor sustainability record. I think that historically there's only 1% of textiles gets recycled globally, and a huge proportion of it ends up in landfill. So textiles is absolutely a focus for ESPR. But I just thought I'd focus on this sector just to give you an idea of, if you were sat today and you're a textiles manufacturer and you wanted to start moving your business towards complying with ESPR, remembering that ESPR is an EU piece of regulation, but globally, markets and bodies like the International Sustainability Standards Board are all looking at the EU and fundamentally grandfathering over the kind of standards and regulation that they implement. So as with any kind of regulation from the EU, if we can comply with this, which is typically the most stringent relating to consumer safety and environmental protections and so on, if we can adhere to EU regulation, then it stands us in very good stead for complying with future global regulation. So if I was a textiles manufacturer today, and I'd be thinking about adhering to this regulation over the next 5 years, I might look at the materials that I use. I might look at moving towards natural fibers. So things like organic cotton or linen or hemp, they're all examples of sustainable natural fibers. They often require less water and chemicals during cultivation and processing. So that they're far more environmentally friendly. I might look at recycled fibers. So I might look at materials like recycled polyester made from plastic bottles, or perhaps recycled cotton, because they're all repurposed materials. So you're using waste to create new material, and you're not having to rely on what we call virgin material, so material that's been cultivated or created, just for this product. There's also what we call regenerated fibers. So lyocell, for example, is made of wood pulp, and that's considered a more sustainable alternative to conventional rayon. And then there's biodegradable fibers. So again, materials like hemp and certain types of cotton are biodegradable, meaning that they can break down naturally after their end of life, after their lifespan's concluded. So that might be the kind of considerations that I'd think about when thinking about my materials, or my raw materials, the composition of my product. And this is why it's important to start engaging with your supply chain as well. This might mean a fundamental shift in your suppliers. If your suppliers can't provide raw materials that help you adhere to sustainability regulation, then there's an argument that says that you should be sourcing other suppliers. Now, moving on to my manufacturing practices. So I've looked at my raw materials, and then I'm thinking about, okay, so what changes can I make internally within my operation around my manufacturing practices? So I might look at reducing my water or energy consumption. So sustainable manufacturing processes obviously focus on minimizing the water and energy usage when producing product. I might look at reducing chemical use. So sustainable practices aim to avoid or reduce at least the amount of harmful chemicals in dyeing or finishing or other kind of like products. And actually, when we look at the digital product passport and making your product information clear for your customers, you do have to disclose those kind of like harmful chemicals or substances of concern, but we'll cover that in a second. And then I might be looking at reducing my waste. So, you know, when we're looking at sustainable manufacturing practices, we're looking at designing products for durability. We're looking at promoting repairability, and we're looking at kind of developing effective recycling programs for, in the case of textile waste, you know, are there programs where I could have my consumers return their clothes when they're finished and I could recycle those into new garments? And then further away, perhaps thinking about our supply chain, we'd be looking at ethical labour practices. So textiles, again, has a poor record in terms of fair labour practices. So I might want to conduct some due diligence on my suppliers around their fair wages, their safe working conditions, no child labour, respect for human rights throughout the entire supply chain. So there are kind of like social issues and ethical labour issues to consider. But assuming I've considered my raw materials and I've considered my manufacturing practices, what are the actual benefits from adopting this kind of approach? You know, what does ESPR fundamentally aim to achieve? Well, fundamentally, it's that environmental protection. So having manufacturers reduce pollution, reduce water usage, reduce their emissions. And with sustainable textiles, obviously, we're contributing to that whole environmental protection. And then resource conservation. So by adopting a sustainable approach to manufacturing, we're helping to conserve those natural resources and reduce reliance on finite resources. And then circular economy. So the whole point of ESPR is around developing this circular economy. So sustainable textile production obviously supports the circular economy because it's promoting reuse, it's promoting recycling, and it's promoting the creation of closed loop systems in terms of that, you know, either having the product recycled at end of life and so on, and recreate or creating new garments. So there's a whole kind of like, it all sounds very wonderful, but there are some practical implications for manufacturing and sourcing of raw materials that we need to consider. When we're talking about the products that are going to be included in this first tranche of regulation, there is what's called a working plan, and that will be in place for 3 years. And we've now got that was launched in April, so we now know what products are going to be included in that first working plan. So they're going to be the focus of the next 3 to 5 years. In terms of the objectives, so as I said before, fundamentally it's to improve the environmental sustainability of products that are placed on the EU market. So it's forcing a reduction in the overall carbon and environmental footprint of products over their entire life cycle, so from design right the way through to end of life. And then it's facilitating or promoting the free movement of those sustainable products in the internal market. Now, it's a huge piece of regulation, and it has quite an extensive scope in terms of product inclusion. So it's going to be phased in over several years. I mean, we'll see new products being incorporated towards the end of the 2030s kind of thing. Now, the first working plan, which I said was released in April, that provides details of the initial products in scope, and they are products that are deemed to have the greatest impact on the environment. So they are products which are widely sold across the EU. They account for about €1 trillion in annual sales. But they also have a big impact on the environment. So they account for about 31% of climate change impacts and 34% of fossil resources used. So by saving energy and other resources through activities relating to those products, the EU is expecting that we can reduce unnecessary consumer expenditure. We can contribute to their clean industrial deal, and it will also encourage stakeholders like manufacturers, importers, distributors, and so on to get involved in the rule setting process. So the disclosures that they make will give the EU, the Commission, a regular kind of insight into manufacturing processes and challenges and so on. And you can imagine that they will use those disclosures to further enhance the regulation as we move forward. So in terms of the scope, so as I've mentioned, this is an extension of the old directive. So there are some core differences between the directive and the new regulation. So the Ecodesign Directive, which remember will still be in force for some time until the regulation is fully implemented. So that mandates that just energy related products, because they're the only products that are within scope of this directive, that they carry a CE mark, that they have obviously an EU declaration of conformity, and that there is a technical file that's been compiled for those products. Now the new regulation, ESPR, obviously covers an expanded product set, and it will insist on all of the aforementioned, so the CE mark, declaration of conformity, the relevant technical file. But in addition to that, it will mandate that the product has a digital product passport, that it has full traceability information, that it has customer instructions, and that it provides details around how the product is to be end of life for the consumer, and it has requirements around the destruction of unsold consumer goods. So where consumer goods have been unsold or have not been sold, then companies will be mandated to report on those or disclose those. Now, the products that are going to be included in this first tranche, I've listed here. So we're looking at textiles and apparels, and I've given the years of when these are going to be kind of like brought online, if you like. And then the only one that I can't find an implementation date for is ICT products. So they are within this first working plan, but we'll have to, I'll have to dig a little bit deeper to find out when that's going to be brought online. So the way that the Commission's done it is they've focused on 4/5, if you take ICT into consideration, 4 final products that they're going to focus on with this first implementation, and 2 intermediate products, which is iron and steel, and then aluminium. And then the kind of eco-design focus, or the legal acts that are going to be imposed on these products, are around repairability, and then recycled content and recyclability of electrical and electronic equipment. Now, there are some exemptions, and I should mention as well that actually this first working plan, if you look at the regulation today, you'd see that there was a lot more products that were destined to be in this first working plan. But when the working plan was announced in April, it actually has a reduced set of products that are going to be in scope for this first tranche. So it's emitted detergents, paints, lubricants, and chemicals. Now, chemicals and some of the others might be included after a midterm review, that they reserve the right to include those. It also importantly emits footwear, which I was surprised. I thought that textiles, apparel, and footwear would be in this first working plan. But footwear, the EU says, has a lower impact than some of the other priority products, and they're going to subject it to a separate study that will be concluded before the end of 2027. So we might see that footwear is added. And as I say, they've emitted chemicals. I think chemicals are, whilst they're of high impact and they're, there's significant improvement potential there around the eco design, they're also a really complex product group. And I think the EU recognises this. They're going to start further analysis on this kind of product group before the end of this year. So we might see chemicals included at some point before 2030, but that will be dependent on the findings from this further analysis. Now, there are exemptions, and they're the usual ones. So with many pieces of regulation like this, the standard exemptions are your food, your feed, medicinal products, veterinary medical products, also living plants, animals, products of human origin, the usual ones, and then vehicles as well are outside of scope. But as always, with any kind of regulation like this, the Commission reserves the right to extend the scope. So Article 5, I think it is, states that the Commission can at any stage set eco-design requirements on new product groups that are not included in this first working plan. So it's important to tune into our updates. We'll try and keep ahead of it, and we'll inform you as more information becomes available. Now, a big part of compliance is the digital product passport. So I did want to focus on this today. So the digital product passport is really a key pillar of ESPR, and its whole purpose is to have us as manufacturers use one or several of what they refer to as R strategies, which I've given a list of these down the right hand side, to help us kind of develop a circular approach to our manufacturing, so help contribute towards the circular economy. So boosting material and energy efficiency, extending product life cycles, and optimizing product use. And some of this goes along with, not just what we do internally, but how we educate our consumers as to how they use our products to get that full, to optimize that product life cycle. And also DPPs obviously provide improved access to data. It's as a digital product passport, it is available. It's in the public domain. Some information will be publicly available, some won't be publicly available, but it's all there stored in one location. And so it gives consumers the kind of accurate information so they can gauge the true impact of their buying behaviors. If they're buying one brand over another brand, what impact is this having on the environment, if you like? Digital product passports, they'll also act as a record of the standards that the product complies with. So it's kind of consolidating everything around the product from, where it's sourced, how it's manufactured, the standards it adheres to, its sustainability performance. I've actually given some bullet points here of the kind of information that you would expect to see in the digital product passport. Now, when we talk about sustainability performance data, that is a big part of the product passport. There will be, and these haven't been announced yet, so this is some of the stuff that will start to come out. So there will be scores relating to a product's repairability, durability, carbon and environmental footprints. There'll be customer information on how to optimize durability. So, specific instructions around installation, use, repair, refurbishment, how to end of life the product. If the product can be recycled, there'll be details on the treatment facilities, details around material composition. So like going back to my example around textiles earlier, information around the fibers and the materials used, including their origin and their environmental impact. There'll be details around the production processes. So again, going back to my textiles example, data on the manufacturing methods, energy consumption, water usage, and then also around social responsibility. So where we've vetted our supply chains and we have a story to tell, and it's a positive story to tell, around, fair sourcing and fair wages and good working conditions, and remunerating our supply chain properly, then that would go in the digital product passports as well. And then importantly, substances of concern. So if you remember from the packaging and packaging waste regulation, there's a big focus on certain substances of concern and trying to eradicate those from our manufacturing processes. So these can really be split into 4 different categories, and it's a whole entire webinar in its own right to go through what these 4 are, but they typically can be grouped into health-related substances. So they're the ones that you might see referenced in REACH regulation. Then there might be specific hazardous substances of concern, and then environmental substances of concern. So they're kind of like your persistent organic pollutants. And then there are others that are identified as substances of concern for recycling and material reuse. So where substances that you use in your manufacturing can negatively impact the reuse and recycling of the materials when that product is kind of end of life. So it's about polluting certain recycling processes, if you like. So every product that is subject to eco-design measures will have a digital product passport, except if there's an alternative digital system. So there's energy-related goods that are subject to the European Product Registry for Energy Labelling. That will remain kind of like their source of information. Everything else will be subject to a digital product passport. And then obviously this has impacts on the labelling of the product as well. So certain information from the digital product passport will feed through into the labelling. So thinking about my garments and my apparel manufacturing. So as a textiles manufacturer, my labelling might be subject to more scrutiny to make sure that the information I'm providing on my products is clear and it's trustworthy and it can be substantiated. So I might have to start including on my labelling information around my carbon footprint, my water consumption, the durability of my products, the repairability or recyclability of my products. And remembering the EU's directive on empowering consumers for the green transition, this is where consumers can potentially sue brands if they feel like they have been missold products. So if a brand has over-egged their sustainability credentials and as a result has kind of tricked the consumer into buying their brand, then the consumer has recourse. They can take action against the brand owner. So that's all around greenwashing. So it's very important moving forward that when we have labelling, when we make claims within our digital product passport, that they're substantiated and backed up with hard data. Motoring on. So on the subject of labelling requirements, the products that will be, how can I go back to this? So the CE mark isn't just around product safety. It's often associated with product safety, but it's also around environmental protection as well. So it makes sense that products that conform to ESPR can have the CE marking affixed to them. So presuming you've complied with the standard, the harmonized standard that will exist for your product type, then you will be able to affix the CE mark to that product. And that really demonstrates to your market, to your consumers, that your product conforms to the requirements laid down under ESPR. If there's a notified body involved in affixing the CE mark, so if the product has been subjected to external testing or verification of those environmental claims, then the notified body identification number would be on the label as well. We're going to see increased use of kind of risk or pictograms. So much of this builds on a lot of work that's been done around GPSR recently. So I'm feeling particularly exuberant for some of our clients that have worked so hard on being GPSR compliant. Some of that hard work gets them so far along the line with ESPR as well, which is good. So we're going to see a lot more use of pictograms or marks that indicate special risks or uses. And then traceability information. So as part of your compliance with the CE mark, we're going to need to have traceability information, which could be product identification information like serial numbers, manufacturer's name, manufacturer's postal address, electronic address, the usual stuff. And then the data carrier. So much of this information is going to be available via what we call a data carrier, so a watermark or a QR code. So the digital product passport probably will more than likely be accessed via a QR code. I think that's probably the main standard that most manufacturers will default to. So much of that will be contained and accessed centrally through that. Information requirements that could be mandated depending on the product that's subject to the regulation. You might have to include substances of concern on the label, instructions as to the safe use of the product, information for disassembly and reuse and so on. And as I've mentioned, misleading or confusing labeling. So goes back to kind of greenwashing. So providing any labeling information that mimics labeling of compliant product that could mislead or confuse consumers or potential consumers is strictly prohibited. And greenwashing over time will carry more and more kind of like penalties where it can be identified that a brand has deliberately misled a consumer through making unsubstantiated sustainability claims, if you like. The eco label, I just wanted to mention this because the eco label is something that's already in existence in the EU, and it products that have been granted authorization to use this label have what's called a presumption of conformity with ESPR. So the eco label is as close as we can get to ESPR compliance at the moment. So if this is affixed to a product, then much of the groundwork has already been done for ESPR compliance. Now, the eco label is actually developed and managed by the Joint Research Centre, which is the EU's, it's not really the EU's, it's independent. It's linked to the EU Commission and it provides independent scientific advice and technical know-how to support all of the EU's policies. It's the GRC that's also now responsible for defining and creating all of the implementing methodologies and indices for repairability and durability, all those kind of like scores and indices and metrics that we're going to have to adhere to for ESPR. It's the GRC that's going to be responsible for that. But the eco label is quite widely recognised in the EU now. I'm not saying that it's particularly hugely adopted, but it is widely recognised. It adheres to ISO standards in terms of how it's kind of established the principles and procedures for developing that environmental labelling. Importantly, there are, depending on the products that you're dealing with, there is an eco label for certain buildings and systems like hard covering products, wood floor coverings, certain electronic equipments like televisions, certain heating systems and household appliances can have an eco label now. There's also certain products within cosmetics and animal care products that can have the eco label affixed because they've got the standard to which the product needs to comply, certain paper products and certain personal use products. So it's gaining in terms of its prevalence across the EU. And obviously the benefits to the businesses, if they've got an eco label, they're improving their image, they're gaining a kind of competitive edge. It shows that they're compliant with green standards. And obviously for consumers, it's a bit like a kite mark. It helps them make informed choices and choose to invest in environmentally friendly products. Now, in terms of performance and information, so how can I best explain this? So products will be expected to substantiate their eco-design credentials, if you like, considering several different aspects of their product. So if we looked at, if you were looking at durability and reliability, you might focus on the product's guaranteed lifetime, the technical lifetime, perhaps the mean time between failures, and so on. If you're looking at the ease of repair and maintenance, you might look at, or you might claim, the availability of the product, the delivery time and affordability of spare parts, the modularity and comparability with commonly available tools and spare parts, and so on and so forth. I'm actually in the process of developing almost like a fact sheet, which I may try and prioritize and circulate that to today's attendees, just so you kind of understand, if you're going to make claims around your product's aspects, how are they going to be measured? What are the kind of metrics that you're going to have to put forward? So, if you were going to focus on use or consumption of energy, water, and other resources, then, what would be the data that you put forward to substantiate that claim that you are focusing on reducing those resources? I'll just make a note of that, because I think that'd be quite good to circulate to people. Disclosure of unsold products. So ESPR looks massively to alter the way we as businesses deal with unsold consumer goods. So we have to, under the regulation, prioritise reuse, refurbishment, or donation of unsold products. Where we can't do that, then I'll move on to that in a second in terms of destruction. But we have to, depending on the size of our business, I'll come to that in just a second, we're mandated to record the number and weight of discarded products, disclose the reason for discarding, make sure that it's clear that it's because they were unsold, or they were damaged, or they were outdated. And then also disclose the handling, the way that we handled those discarded products. So the proportion that were reused or refurbished or remanufactured or recycled, and so on. Now, in terms of that public disclosure, so larger businesses are going to have to disclose this kind of data on their website and include it in their annual sustainability reports. So major enterprises, so those large corporates from July this year, I think it is, will have to start disclosing. This is just EU companies, but obviously if you have, if you're affiliated with an EU company that has to report on this kind of stuff, then that may have an impact on what you disclose and what data you have to give them, so that they can incorporate it into their disclosures. So major corporates by July this year will have to start reporting on those discarded products. I think it's not until 2030 that medium-sized enterprises will have to make those disclosures. But then micros and small enterprises at the moment are exempt. But as with everything with the EU, any kind of regulation is always going to filter down to the SME level at some point. Fundamentally, because SMEs make up, or small enterprises make up small cogs in larger supply chains. And in order to help your larger customers or suppliers comply with the regulation that they have to comply with, you might have to give them certain information. So I always think that even if you're exempt, it's good to start recording this kind of information, because you don't know when it will become applicable to you. Now, thinking about the destruction of products, so linked to the previous slide, preventing the destruction of unsold consumer goods is a massive focus for ESPR. And destruction is not confined to the meaning the complete ruin or demolition of a product. It can include intentional damage or discarding a product of waste as waste. So the destruction term is really quite broad. In terms of consumer products that are kind of like within scope of this prohibition, it will be products that have perhaps not been sold because they're surplus stock or excess inventory, perhaps products that have been returned by the consumer. The regulation is moving towards preventing the destruction of that product, and instead encouraging it be reused in some way. Now, there are some derogations to this. So, destruction might be appropriate for health, hygiene, and safety reasons. It might be because the product's damaged, beyond any kind of potential repair. It might be because the product's unfit for its intended purpose. Perhaps it's failed technical standards. And it might be, another big one is that might be because the product is unsaleable due to infringement of IP rights. So it could be like counterfeit goods, for example. So there are some circumstances where destruction is permitted. Now, in terms of the core requirements, so all companies, irrespective of size, are to take necessary measures to prevent the need to destroy those unsold consumer goods. But when it comes to transparency in those disclosures, large enterprises, it's not until next year, July 2026, that corporates will have to disclose information on the amount of unsold consumer goods that they've destroyed in that year, and that will have to go on their website again and within their sustainability reporting. And then prohibition. So this is quite important. In the first working plan that I referred to earlier, the Commission has stated that it won't ban the destruction of products in this first phase. It believes that it's too premature to be able to say definitively you can't destroy these products, because they need to rely on some of the disclosures, so some of the information that it gleans from those basically those corporates in the first instance, to be able to understand how to impose those bans, if that makes sense. I haven't really explained that very well, but what was meant to be included was they were going to impose a ban on the destruction of apparel and clothing, like made of leather, knitted or crocheted, and also footwear, whether that be of rubber, plastic, leather or textiles. But that hasn't been imposed in this first working plan because the EU just deems that it's a little bit too premature to impose that ban. Declaration of conformity, so linked to the affixing of the CE mark. So in order to affix the CE mark, we'll have to have tested our products or subjected our products to certain tests, measure the kind of eco-design elements, that recyclable or durability elements, and we'll be using calculation methods that hopefully are going to be announced by the EU. So there will be harmonized standards for these kind of like calculations, and the EU has promised digital tools that will be freely accessible for everyone, irrespective of size. So we'll be watching out for those. There will be, similar to all EU regulation, there'll be what we call a presumption of conformity, where we've calculated our data according to harmonized standards, or where we've compiled a digital product passport that's in conformity with the harmonized standard for that, and so on. There'll be a presumption of conformity. Conformity assessment procedures, obviously they'll be appropriate to the type of product and to the relevant eco-design requirements. Technical documentation, the usual stuff that we pull together. So, where a CE mark is affixed to a product, that needs to be accompanied by a technical document. Not necessarily all that data will be in the public domain via the digital product passport. Some of it will be kind of hidden, but that would have all of your product and compliance related documentation around product design, drawings, photos, bills of material, product labeling files, packaging files, and so on. Importantly, what I should have mentioned earlier around the digital product passport, the digital product passport will cover packaging as well. So that's kind of like where it links with the packaging waste regulation as well. So within the digital product passport, you'll have sustainability performance metrics around the product, but you'll also have it where applicable around the packaging, the product's packaging as well. Where you've got your technical file and you've affixed your CE mark, obviously you've got the declaration of conformity, which you must draw up as the manufacturer, and that must be regularly updated. So as new standards appear, the regulation must be, the declaration of conformity must be kept up to date, and importantly must be in the language of the member state where the product is being sold. You can have a single EU declaration of conformity. So if the product already has a declaration of conformity for certain other harmonized standards, then ESPR standards will be able to be added to that declaration of conformity. In terms of the CE mark, the usual rules apply. Anybody that's affixed the CE mark to their product knows that there are specific rules around font size and the kind of, I can never think of the word, the size of the CE logo and the visibility and legibility of the information that you're putting on the CE label. So yes, that's probably one of the biggest changes, is that products that maybe in the past haven't required the CE mark probably will do now, because they're going to comply with these environmental measures as well. In terms of market surveillance, so if you sat in on any of my webinars before, you'll know that market surveillance is a kind of, it's devolved to individual member states. So it's a national competence, and the Commission acts in a kind of support and coordination role. Evidence suggests that compliance around energy relating products and sustainable design is actually quite low. And so the EU knows that it's not reaping all of the benefits that it could do. Online sales, distance sales, or online sales via platforms, especially non-EU online platforms, are identified as being particularly problematic. So surveillance of those kind of platforms is going to be a priority. So we're going to see the likes of Amazon and eBay and Etsy and so on subjected to a lot of scrutiny around the eco credentials of their traders and what is on those product listings. There was 2 reports undertaken recently that identified that the EU is not really supporting member states sufficiently. So we're going to see a lot more involvement from the Commission and a lot more support for member states around the implementation of eco-design regulation. And then there will be, there's no doubt that certain product categories are going to be identified as more high risk of non-compliance, and where they're kind of tagged as high risk of non-compliance, we're going to see market surveillance authorities ramp up the kind of checks that they do. So they'll include both physical and potentially laboratory checks, and where they have to subject a product to a laboratory check, they can claw back the costs of that documentary inspection and physical product testing from the economic operator, so the manufacturer, the EU importer, for example. There's a whole load of packaging support, a whole load of support that is being drafted for member states at the moment. And then not forgetting to mention the role of customs. So obviously we in the UK, yes, that's where we are today. Obviously, we have to get our product through customs before it can be subjected to any further market surveillance activity. So customs are always the eyes and ears of our market surveillance authorities in the EU. So they have an essential role in supporting the policy delivery for imports from third countries like ours. So they'll be checking compliance of digital product passports. And there'll be there's certainly a lot of investment gone into better integrated data-driven models to kind of further cement or consolidate the kind of interaction between customs and the market surveillance authority. So it's going to become a lot more joined up, and we're going to see a lot more cooperation between individual member states, customs authorities, and market surveillance authorities. In terms of impacted parties, there's a lot more than you might have seen on the GPSR regulation webinars that I've done. So but fundamentally, it's quite similar in terms of how the regulation breaks this down. So I'm just going to whiz through a few of these. So if you're the manufacturer of the goods, and again, the same principle of when a manufacturer is not a manufacturer applies in ESPR, just as it did in GSPR. So GPSR, I'm getting the acronyms confused now. So if you have rebranded the goods, or if you've altered the goods to such an extent that they are different, fundamentally different, then you assume the obligations of manufacturer to comply with ESPR. So your obligations as the manufacturer to make sure that, you know, the products have been designed and manufactured in accordance with the performance requirements, which we'll see released over the coming months. That products are accompanied by sustainability performance information, which might be mandated on the label, but more than likely in the digital product passport. That there is a digital product passport, that as the manufacturer you've made sure that that's available, and importantly that digital product passport is stored by a passport service provider. Now, any of you on the call today that have used Global Trade Department as your GPSR compliance hub, if you like, using our platform, we are actively looking at introducing a digital product passport, importantly, just as our GPSR compliance is, at an affordable price, so that our clients can continue selling without having to outlay huge amounts of money on being compliant with this. So we will be developing a digital product passport module, and we'll keep you informed of that for those of you that are interested, because certain clients that have used us for GPSR, a lot of the information that you will need for your digital product passport, some of which we already have. So we'll be building on that for the product passport. Obviously, as the manufacturer, you'll be making sure that you've carried out a conformity assessment, you've pulled together your technical file, you've got your declaration of conformity, the CE mark's been affixed, your technical documentation is kept for 10 years. All of the usual stuff really that you would expect as the manufacturer. Obviously, there's requirements around labelling of products. What else would I draw to your attention there? It's really around, I suppose, something that is quite new, but actually not so burdensome because it's going to be via the digital product passport, is the requirement to provide instructions, digital instructions for your products, and they must be available for 10 years from the point at which the product was placed on the market. And then there's a requirement for, you may need to supply those instructions in paper format for up to 6 months after the consumer's purchased the product. It may never come to pass. So many people prefer to access user instructions online now, but that is within the regulation. Obviously, the digital instructions must be in the relevant language of the member state, but it becomes a lot less burdensome when we can store that digitally accessed via a QR code than currently with GPSR, where we're having to send hard copies of stuff like that. What else? Authorised representatives are not mandated. So you currently, as the manufacturer, you can kind of like outsource much of this stuff to your authorised representative in the EU, but it's not mandatory. Importers, again, their role is to make sure that any product, your EU importers, to make sure that any product that they place on the market is compliant with the ESPR. So they'll be looking to make sure that the conformity assessment procedure is being carried out, that there's technical documentation, the sustainability performance criteria is there. They can access the digital product passport, that the product's CE marked. And then similarly, any non-compliant product, they can't place that on the market till it's been brought into conformity. So they'd probably push that back to you, whether it be a labelling requirement or something missing from the digital product passport. So they're really they're holding you account for ESPR compliance, but their name would go on the product as the importer, and within the digital product passport as well, where relevant. And they have a role to play in terms of bringing product into conformity. So non-compliant product on the market, the importer has a role in playing to bring that into conformity. And obviously they can cooperate and liaise with the national market surveillance authorities, informing of any corrective action taken in the case of non-compliance. Distributors, lesser obligations, just as we've seen with GPSR. I suppose one of the differences is the importer can hold your technical file for the goods, but your distributor usually wouldn't. But they would want to make sure that, you know, they could have access to that technical file, or be able to point the national market surveillance authorities towards the importer or the manufacturer for that technical file, if needed. And unlike GPSR, where, you know, depending on the severity of the product safety issue, there might be really tight turnarounds to get that information to the market surveillance authorities. With ESPR, we've actually got a 15-day kind of lead time, so you've got up to 15 days to provide that information to the market surveillance authorities. Dealers, this is a new one, so just likening it to GPSR, dealers is an individual or a company that makes product available. They're checking things like, you know, that there's a digital product passport, that customers have access to all the information that they need, that labeling is correct, and so on, but they don't hold any technical file, they don't hold the EU Declaration of Conformity, nothing like that. And then fulfillment service providers, so 3PLs, they're fundamentally making sure that whilst the product's in their care, nothing they do from a warehousing or packaging or labelling or dispatching perspective impacts the product's compliance with the ESPR. And then online marketplaces and search engines have requirements as well. So fundamentally, they are to cooperate with the surveillance authorities to make sure that action's taken to remove any non-compliant product from the market, or to help market surveillance authorities basically kind of take action against the traders that have put that what is classed as illegal content on the market. And obviously they have to provide a single point of contact for that direct communication with the market surveillance authority. So we will start to see the likes of Etsy, eBay, Amazon and so on start to get their ducks in a row with regard to ESPR over the coming months. In terms of some of the stuff that the EU is doing to try and reduce the burden on micros and small businesses, so there's going to be, we're told, a plethora of digital tools and guidelines that they are going to be consulting with representative bodies for small businesses to try and gauge the impact of them complying with this kind of regulation. And the idea is that they simplify it for businesses with less than 50 employees. There should be available training, video tutorials, and a whole host of stuff to help us get our heads around what compliance looks like. Within the EU, and I don't know whether the UK may do something similar, but we you know, there isn't an awful lot of funding around these days within the UK for stuff like this, but the EU SMEs are going to be potentially in receipt of financial support, particularly around, you know, investing in enhanced digital infrastructure to help them comply with this kind of stuff. And then, as I said, micros and small enterprises might be exempt from some compliance requirements, but I caveat that with everything, it can change. So where we can comply, even though it's not mandatory, where we can start to gather information, even though it's not mandatory, it stands us in very good stead for should that change in the future, or dependent on our suppliers or customers, should they come to us for that kind of data so that we can help them be compliant, if that makes sense. Implementation timeline, I'm very conscious of time here, so I'm just going to rattle through some of this. So regulation came into force last year. As I've said, mandatory disclosures are required for the large corporates from July this year in the EU. We've got the prohibition of destruction of unsold consumer goods for major enterprises, as I've mentioned, that's not been included in the working plan. So that's the discrepancy between the regulation and the working plan. But essentially for us, in terms of micros and small businesses, much of this is about monitoring and starting to move our supply chains and our manufacturing processes towards a more eco-sustainable methodology or way of working, if you like, because our products might not be within the initial working plan, but similarly they might not be within the initial working plan, but we've also got up to maybe 2030 to start adapting to some of these new requirements. So how do we prepare? So fundamentally, as I'm keen to, and I'm conscious that so many of us on this call today have limited time, and we're running businesses and we wear multiple different hats, and any kind of sustainability regulation feels like a huge burden and a huge headache. And when I say start gathering environmental impact data, you're thinking, what planet is she on? I can't, there are only 24 hours in a day. But what I want to get across is that this isn't going away. The EU is at the forefront of this kind of regulation, but it's been grandfathered over globally, and the UK will catch up. I know we're slightly behind the curve, and there is some deviation between EU and UK sustainability regulation at the moment in terms of implementation timescales, but it's not going away. So the more data that we can start to capture on our emissions, on our energy consumption, on our water usage, waste generation, and resource efficiency, that all stands us in good stead for being able to adapt to comply with this regulation. Like I say, it's not going away, and some of it actually, now that the sustainability regulation starting to bed in, there's a lot more free online tools. There's a lot more explanations around how you measure some of this kind of stuff. And if in doubt, get in touch. Maybe we run a webinar on, measuring your emissions or something like that. That there's support out there, and yeah. I appreciate it's a huge task. From what it's very easy for me to say, oh, start gathering environmental impact data, but it's not going away. And so it's best to start now. Look at the product life cycle. Look at the life cycle of your product. So look at your product's environmental impacts throughout its entire life cycle. So from its raw material extraction right the way through to disposal. Pull together data on all of your inputs, so your materials, your energy, and so on, and then your outputs. What are your emissions? What are your wastes? And then that will help you understand where your biggest environmental impacts lie and how you can reduce them. And obviously, remembering that, as I've said on several webinars now, we are starting to see a significant rise in the number of environmentally conscious customers, whether they be consumers or business customers. So where we're trapping this information, where we're making tangible improvements, then we need to be shouting about that, because it's a differentiation. It's something that could set you apart from other brands in your sector. Look at existing standards. So we know that ESPR is kind of, emerging at the moment, and will gather more and more information and feed that through to you. But there are existing standards for circularity. So ISO 59020 has minimum data requirements for quantifying the circularity of your products. So that's an interesting one to look at. Again, think about your supply chain, the importance where you're sourcing raw materials or where you're sourcing products that are made for you. You can never start too early to have those conversations about those sustainable materials and making sure that they're, adhering to eco-design principles. So, track the origins and the environmental impact of those materials and components or finished goods if they're being made for you. Invest in circular design principles. Sounds very, la-di-da, but shifting from a kind of linear approach to manufacturing, where you kind of like, take raw materials, make the product, and then the product goes to waste. That's kind of like a linear model, to a more circular approach. So, think about those take back schemes, those repair options, the kind of recycling opportunities, all part of your kind of product stewardship strategy. And again, something to shout about, not only to help you become compliant with this regulation and other global regulation, but obviously something to shout about in terms of promoting your brand. Consider your composition and material. So like I said, going back to that, me placing myself in the shoes of a textile manufacturer, focusing on durable and recyclable materials, as well as materials with a low carbon footprint, primarily avoiding what we call virgin materials, and importantly those substances of concern, which I mentioned earlier. Consider your energy consumption and what opportunities there are to reduce that. Access sustainability assessment tools. So there's quite a few out there at the moment, and I've mentioned two: the material circularity indicator and the circular transition indicator. They're quite good to take a look at. Stay informed of regulatory requirements. We will try and do that for you. We are totally committed to trying to, in the best possible way, get this regulation across to you in a way that just tells you what you need to do, rather than burdening you with all the regulatory speak. And I'm conscious I'm not always the best person to do that, but I am trying. So we'll keep you informed of the regulatory developments, and then start compiling that data for the digital product passport. And those of you that are interested in furthering that kind of, what do we need to do, what do we need to do to be prepared, and potentially using the GTD platform at some point for that provision, then we're happy to have those discussions. Again, it will be another module that we add on to our existing platform, because our clients already have a certain amount of information in there that we can use for the passport. But there will be other providers as well. So, as with everything, shop around, find a provider that you feel comfortable with, and importantly at a price point that you can afford. This regulation, as I said with GPSR, don't let this be the reason that you stop selling to the EU. The EU is still a hugely important market for us here in Great Britain, not least because of what's happening in other parts of the world, not to mention Trump and so on. So and as I say, if we can comply with the EU's sustainability regulation, we can comply with stuff globally. The last slide is basically just the next webinar. So we've shook stuff up a little bit because the new European Accessibility Act comes into play at the end of this month. So we thought we'd put on a webinar for that, which has pushed back our deforestation regulation webinar. And then there's one that so many questions that come for you around the management of VAT and duties and Incoterms for selling into the EU. There's no doubt that Brexit has had a huge impact on our B2C trade, our e-commerce into the EU, and we really need to get a handle on that. So we wanted to put a webinar on that can kind of break down what you need to do and what your options are to kind of reinstate your competitiveness in the EU and reinstate that customer experience that EU consumers were so familiar with before Brexit. And then again, if you've got any particular knowledge gaps or issues that are impacting what you're doing, just let us know. We might, if there's enough interest, then we might put a webinar on for that as well. So I'm really sorry that this is like such a boring subject. Regulation is never sexy, but it is really important. It's quite often, putting aside what Trump's doing with the US tariffs, it's not tariffs that impede international growth. It's usually regulation and the inability to comply with that regulation. So I hope that's helped. I'm sure I've lost a few of you because we've gone well over time, but it is being recorded. So I can always send that to everybody. I'm just going to have a quick look in the queue.